want to introduce our next speaker, Mitchell Knuppel. He's the third person in a row who has better hair than me, and it's a little distracting. It's kind of painful, hurts my feelings. But he's going to talk about you don't need permission to lead. Get up for Mitchell.
Yep. Awesome. It's great to be here. So my name is Mitchell Knuppel. I'm a software analyst at Southern Company. A little about myself. Started out as a consultant straight out of college, and I loved it. It was a great time. You know, learned how to work with people, work with the business to understand their problems, their needs, build solutions around it. And it was a really great time. I learned a lot. But I've also never been in a formal leadership supervisor position. Been an individual contributor, as they say, but a developer my whole career. And, over that time, I've thought of myself kind of as a leader trying to make things happen without having, that title. So we're going to talk about how to drive this meaningful change without having that formal role. So to start off with, great ideas, they don't really fail because of their merit. They fail because they're poorly positioned. So who all here has had a great idea? You talked about it with somebody, but it just never happened. Yeah, see, just about everybody. See, happens all the time, and it stinks. You want to have something happen. You want to make this change because you think from the technical side that it is going to make everything so much faster, so much better, so much easier to work with. But the people in charge who make the decisions, let you go and do it, they say no. Well, that's not fun. But as a developer, there's ways that we can kind of get around that, right? We can help influence people to make them understand why we are talking about that. Why would we suggest that we change the code that we're using, the models, the layouts? Why would we do that? And oftentimes it's because of risk aversion. People are scared of risk, right? People like to gamble, but they also don't want to gamble their job. So they will try to avoid risk as much as possible. And office politics, that's unavoidable, right? If you're a developer for a company, people are going to be concerned about the office politics, not getting into somebody's turf, not stealing other people's budget, all that stuff. But there's also my least favorite part, which people are probably pretty familiar with. That's just the way that it's always been done. And I'll talk about that more in a second, but that's the most common one that I've experienced. So, we're going to talk about, how leaders actually think about and evaluate the risk of your ideas. Why sometimes our arguments might fall flat from a technical perspective, right? We're developers, we're technical people. We might talk about, oh, hey, here's, our architecture is outdated, our test coverage is low. Well, what does that mean, right? We're going to talk about how to frame the change as safe, incremental, and most importantly, reversible, your backup plan. How to build trust and to speak with stakeholders, right? Not just talk about your technical jargon, throw it at them, and they don't understand it. That's no fun. Nobody likes that. And also how to advocate for these ideas without burning those bridges. So why do these good ideas get blocked? First and foremost, like I said, risk aversion. Everybody's scared of change. Change sometimes can be scary. Sometimes it's not. But oftentimes, especially for an organization, it's scary. There's risk associated with it. And politics. Whose budget is it going to come from? Who's going to pay for this? Is it somebody else's solution that you're trying to take down or replace? You don't want to do that. You don't want to step on toes there. And, it's not just about the code. It's more to the code than that. It's more about the business. That's how the people who make these decisions are going to see it. And again, the inertia, it's just how it's always been done, right? In my case, I've worked with applications that have been around for 20, 30 years, and they're a pain to work with. They're older than I am. That's not fun. I don't know anything about this stuff. I don't know anything about this language that was created sometime in the 80s, but we're still using for some reason. That's not fun to work with. It takes a lot of time to learn, and if we're just going to replace it, why not do it now? But it's always been done. People don't want to change things. They don't want to break it up and modernize because we've been doing this for 20 years. We already know that it's a pain to deploy it, make a change, implement a feature, but what's the risk associated, or what's going to look like if we change it, right? But if we've done it for 20 years, we're already familiar with it, it's not so bad, right? But probably the most important thing is that leadership isn't a title, right? You can lead as a developer, as an individual contributor, right? But authority, um, makes people want to work with you. They want to listen to your ideas and implement them. But authority, again, that's more of a it makes people comply. That's their job as somebody who has the authority. But as a leader, you make them want to work with you, right? So you lead people, through influence, and it's not something you can just get on day one or overnight. It takes some time, right? You have to build the trust with people who work around you, everybody on your team, your supervisors, everybody. They need to be able to trust you, but you also need to build some credibility. You need to get some past wins. And they don't have to be any crazy wins like, oh, we saved $20 million. They can be small things. It's like, sure, we increased our test coverage and now we have 10% fewer bug reports in the next quarter. Great. Talk about it, share it. There's nothing wrong with bragging on yourself. And that's something that was, for me, that was hard to learn. I didn't want to go in and brag to my manager, like say, hey, look what I did. Nobody wants to brag on themselves, but if you do, well, then you get that reputation of, hey, look what I did, look what I can do, right? Here's what I did. Maybe I did it in addition to my expected workload, but it did this and it helps people, X amount. People want to understand, your reputation so you can build that credibility, document your wins, share them. And you got to know, how you frame the risk, right? So, or how you frame the ask. You got to frame it. And you can't just go in there and, like I said, give it the technical jargon. Not everybody's going to understand that, but you have to do it correctly. So, how do leaders actually evaluate risk? And again, this comes from stuff that I've learned over the past few years, and the most common one is the blast radius, right? And I think we can all kind of understand that one. The blast radius. Okay, if we do this, what else are we going to break? And if you deal with a lot of enterprise systems, there's probably there's a huge blast radius. You change one thing, we could break all the other integrations. Oops, but you didn't know that. So they're not going to ask, okay, is it a good idea? They're going to think about what happens if this goes wrong, right? Who's responsible for this and what's going to happen? So the blast radius is the first key thing, but also, is this reversible? Can we back out of this? Sometimes it's as easy as just pushing the previous version. That's great. But other times, and again, if you're working with older code bases, maybe you accidentally broke half the database. Oops. Well, that's no good. So you got to have a plan for that, right? There's also accountability. So if it does break, stuff does hit the fan, okay? Who's leadership going to look to? Who are they going to point fingers at, right? You need to have that in mind as well when you're talking to your leaders about these ideas. And finally, if you're working in something like where I work, a utility company, what's the worst news headline that this could create? Could this be a really big problem? Could this cost a lot of money? Could people get in trouble or get hurt from this change? So those are all things that leaders usually use to evaluate the risk of these ideas. So just from a general level here, when you're presenting a technical argument, you oftentimes as a developer, we like to get technical. We like to give you the technical details, the nitty gritty, and say, oh, our test coverage is only 40%. We should do something about that. Okay. Well, who's paying for the improved test coverage? Where's that coming from? What's the point? Right? You need to frame it with the consequence of if we don't do this, right? If we don't improve test coverage, if we don't modernize this, if we don't, implement this sort of pipeline, then this will happen. We're close to one bad deployment shutting down the entire solution for a whole weekend, and that's going to cost however much. That's going to get this many people stuck out in the field. We can't do that, right? So you need to emphasize the consequence of, hey, here's the current state. Here's what could happen right now. Here's a path to get us there to a successful future state. So in order to make these changes happen, you also want to think about how to make this change easy to say yes to, right? So you got to present it as safe. You don't want to come in there and say, hey, we're going to change everything, break it up. Everything's going to be way different. You want to start small, right? And sometimes it doesn't sound as fun because if you're like me, you like to have big ideas and do big things and make it happen, but you got to start small, right? Small blast radius, get a proof of concept out there, mock something up. Because right now we're in a really cool time with AI as developers where we can just kind of have something on the side and the little agent run and build something for us, build a mock-up, proof of concept, just to try something out, see how it goes. That could be your proof of concept. You can show that to somebody, right? And that's going to give them the confidence, say, hey, maybe this is a not so bad approach. Maybe this is safe. Maybe we can do this. And then once they see that this is, we can do this, increment. Or if, as people in the agile world like to say, iterate and do whatever. But go one step at a time, right? Start small, get a plan going, identify what you can do next, how you can carry this forward. And then, of course, again, make sure it's reversible. If you need to go back, have that ready. Be prepared to talk about that. So to lower the cost of saying yes, and again, this goes back to the whole, risk aversion part, scope it down, put in one service at a time, one sprint, make it visible. And this goes back to brag on yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. Talk about your wins, share them with people, write them down, store it somewhere, because we probably all have annual performance reviews. You'll need some talking points for those. So write down your wins. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And then keep the exit. Have that ready when you're talking about these ideas. And all this comes down to trust. People need to be able to trust you when you're presenting these ideas. If you come in on the first day and you have all these great ideas, that's fantastic. It's not going to hurt anything, but you got to have some trust in your built up before you go and talk about these things or try to implement these things. So you need to be able to deliver reliably. So if you've already been a developer for a while, people probably trust you. You're able to get your work done. People can count on you to get it done. That's what people want you to have. So you get that done, but then you also have to give credit, right? It's not, your show. It's not your application. You got to think about it from the team level, right? Give credit to other people. If other people have great ideas, talk about it with them. If somebody does something really well, say, good job. That's awesome. Give them credit. And don't be shy to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with being positive and helping people out. And then finally, reduce the stress and don't add to it, right? It's hard to do, it's easier said than done, but, be the person who tries to make the problem smaller. Don't try to cause a huge problem. Just think about, again, small scale, small blast radius, but make the stress level as small as possible the whole time. So, and again, when you got to speak their language, right? We might think about, we need to refactor a legacy module. To anybody else who was not at this conference, they probably think, I don't know what you're talking about. That's really crazy. But think about it. Hey, what's the benefit of this? We can cut the time it takes to implement any new feature, right? And again, we're in the time of AI right now. We can do that probably pretty quickly. Pay down technical debt. What does that mean? Does our code owe money to somebody? No, it just means that this maybe could stop outages from costing customers. So we got to frame it like that. Or how can we adopt CI/CD? That's a pretty popular thing. We still have applications, that some of them don't fully go through CI/CD, and that's a pain, right? It's no fun having to package up files manually, drop them somewhere for somebody to put in another shared folder from this shared folder. It's annoying and frustrating. But you got to think about the value and share that, right? So if we have a full CI/CD pipeline, well, how much time does that save from not just myself, but my whole team, plus the infrastructure team, plus the DBA who already doesn't like us, to get this out and ship it in a couple hours instead of a few planned weeks? That's not fun, right? And then again, increased test coverage. Okay, what does that mean? Well, spend fewer weeks firefighting, reduce the amount of bugs that get reported, possibly prevent huge financial issues that could come from the app breaking. And then you also want to push hard but stay trusted. You can have great ideas, but you want to be able to talk about them without immediately tucking your tail and backing down, right? Easier said than done again, but you want to socialize your idea, talk about it with people. There's nothing wrong with just talking and brainstorming. That's a great thing to do. Share your ideas and let them think that they help come up with that idea or that plan, right? Get other people on board with you so you can work together to come to that solution. And this is a fun one: disagree and commit. Disagreements aren't fun, but disagreements can lead to conversation, which leads to agreement, right? So disagreement is totally fine when you're presenting ideas. Again, people are going to be scared. They're going to be, scared of risk or the politics or the rollback. But you can talk through that. Be able to talk through it, not just from a technical perspective, but as the business might interpret it, right? And be able to commit to it so that once y'all get on the same page and you can agree on something, even if it is a compromise, you can commit to it, right? And try to pilot and don't mandate. Start small again. Start small. Try it out. Even if it is something that maybe not in your expected workload, you can try something. Spin up an agent on the side, implement this to try it out, proof of concept it, and then see if there's any benefits. Small implementation of it, not the whole solution. Try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't, what'd you lose? But never make it personal. And this one, working on a team, it can be pretty easy to identify somebody who may not be pulling their weight. That happens, right? Some people miss test cases. The test coverage isn't fully, thorough, and it doesn't get the whole application. And it can be a recurring problem, right? But you never want to make it about a single person and their faults or what they missed, right? You want to focus on the problem and how we can solve it together. So, what does that look like in practice? This is an example that came up with an engineer, wanted to automate testing on a flaky service. But instead of mandating the whole team go and implement their test coverage requirements, she tried on one service, right, one at a time, framed it as fully reversible. That's how they communicated it. And it showed that there was a 60% drop in rollbacks, which that sounds like a huge win, but it was just a small implementation of it. Not really much consequence there, but it was a huge win. Helped a lot of that. And then once it was socialized, the team lead said, hey, now we're going to mandate it. Now we're going to make it happen. But that person, that engineer, didn't have formal authority. They took it on themselves to lead and try it out. And then it turned into, that mandate. So I want y'all to think about, what is an idea that you had that you presented that maybe didn't go as you expected? Think about that real quick. It could be anything. It could be something small, something big. And think about, it didn't go, but how could I frame it as, what was the smallest, most reversible first step for that? And what could I have done better there in terms of presenting it? Okay, and if I didn't really identify the risk beforehand, well, what was the risk from that? What could have happened? And then how would you say it in their words, right? How could you reframe that entire idea when you talked about it? How could you socialize that better? How could you say it in business terms? Identify the consequences up front, identify a plan for the whole thing. So some takeaways here. The main thing I want you to take away is that, if you position your ideas, don't just prove them right. You have to make sure that they are communicated thoroughly. You can't just go at it from a technical perspective, because that doesn't always work. You need to be able to make change safe, incremental, and reversible. You also need to be able to translate those facts into the business state. And you need to be able to build trust before you ever spend it. So one thing that I've done personally is that, in order to build this trust, is that on my team, I took that proof of concept that I worked on. I used Copilot for a couple hours one day to take this 10,000 line calculation process that we have for some financial records that it does. It was a pain. There were like 3 different languages that were used to develop it, spanning between the database, some old batch jobs, some C# code sprinkled in there somewhere, and nobody really knew how it worked. But we knew what the code consisted of, 10,000 plus lines of all that. Okay, we looked at it. We took a quick estimate to see how long it would take somebody to modernize that. It's a critical piece of this application. It's essentially the core functionality of it. But how long would it take somebody to go and do it, right? Without AI assistance, that is, just to try it, just think about it. So we got together and we thought about it, and we said, okay, it'd probably take 2 or 3 developers, probably 2 or 3 months to do this. And when you think about that, it's okay, well, how much is that going to cost? How much is what's the time frame for that? Is this necessary? And then we took Copilot and said, hey, here's what we want you to do. Go ahead and do this. Here's the code. Here's the purpose of it. Rewrite it for us. Do this for us, just to see what happens. Because this was not necessarily early on when Copilot was available, but it was one of the first times that we had access to Copilot. and we're able to use it for our work. And we took it and we said, okay, rewrite it. So it took, I think, about 2 days in total for AI to take the legacy code, convert it into one single code base, one single solution, and give it one-to-one data parity. And that was huge for us. We were dealing with that 20-plus-year-old application that it's passed hands so many times and nobody really knows how it works because it's gone through so many different enterprise-wide initiatives and so many integrations that nobody really fully understands it. It's a pain. But we took AI, let it do that, prove it out, and we didn't implement it. It wasn't my plan. I just want to try it out. And I just talked about it. I said, hey, look what this did in a couple of days. We talked about it and it could have done it. We could have hired people to do it in a few months, but we did it in a couple of days. Look what we can do, right? We have the ability to do a lot of cool stuff now. We can make these changes. We can fix these things. We can go through all these projects now without having to worry about, oh man, it'll take 3 years to implement this feature or this integration, because nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to think about the money that costs, right? So I proved that out and I shared it with people. I shared it with my team. I shared it with my supervisor, and they got the trust in me to go and look at the bigger picture, right? So I was taking action as myself, an individual contributor, a developer, to go and do these things. And I did this really on the side. This wasn't my assigned project at the time. This was like, well, I got a few minutes to kill. Let me start, prompting here, asking Copilot. It would run on the side, and it did it. So I took leadership on my own, and I didn't have a supervisor or manager role. So all that being said, you already have permission to lead. You don't have to think about leadership as a title. You can be a leader, and you have all these tools available to you. So lead anyways. Thanks.
Thanks, Mitchell. Anybody got any questions? Anybody? Cool. All right. So thanks, Mitchell. One more time.